On the Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast today, I'm joined by Oscar Clarke and Emily Inkpen for a discussion about games and the various writing and creative projects and elements to the world of gaming. So, Oscar Clarke has been working in games since 1998 with teams of all sizes, from BT and PlayStation to countless indie game developers. He also wrote the book on games as a service. Oscar, hi, welcome to Alternative Stories.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, a pleasure to be here. I don't get to talk enough about writing in games, and I love it. I'm obsessed by the whole process.
Well, much more on that to come. Emily Inkpen is also here. Emily is the creative director of Alternative Stories, the writer of our award-winning audio drama series, The Dex Legacy, a novelist and short story writer, and she's worked as a writer in the games industry, a keen tabletop role-playing gamer, and video game player. Emily, hello, welcome.
Hello. Yes, all of those things.
All of those things, indeed.
Yeah.
I should put my cards on the table to say that I haven't really done much gaming for a very, very long time. Although I did dabble in Dungeons and Dragons and Traveller and a few kind of quite early role-playing games back in the day.
Two of the best out there.
Two of the best. Yes, the original is still the best. But yes, so my ignorance will probably come across quite profoundly in this one. So please be kind to me. And my first question really is, why would a podcast like this that talks about literature, drama, and storytelling be interested in the world of gaming?
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And the first thing is that there's a different kind of storytelling that happens in a game. So games are very different from other kind of mediums because we're a verb. But what that does is it introduces different ways of looking at narrative arcs. It looks at things like actual passive kind of narrative exploration. For what I mean by that is, like, let's take a game like Tetris. Okay. So in Tetris, is there a story? Well, there is, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. But the simple way of thinking about it is, I've got a visceral movement of pieces down the board. There's a sense of impending doom and tension. If I've got to move them and position them correctly, if I get that right, then I'm successful, and I manage to put that in a place where it clears a line, and there's a relief. But they keep coming. They keep coming, and there's a sense of endless doom. And I think that's really kind of an example of how emergent play is a personal story. The really funny thing in some ways is that there was a story in the original Tetris. If you got through to a certain level, it would unlock the Kremlin, the roof of the Kremlin would open up, and big laser guns would appear and shoot the aliens.
Good Lord.
Which,
not many
most
people know
have forgotten
that.
about. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that we are all, what are games other than stories that we do? And so if we don't understand the playful nature of telling narrative, if we don't understand what playing does to give back to narrative, we're missing a massive hole on what the human experience of stories are.
And also leaving space for the human, like the individual story within the game as well.
Absolutely.
Like games that look like they don't have necessarily a lot of storytelling in their structure. I mean, we've got at one end of the spectrum something like God of War, the recent God of War games, which are very scripted and almost playable movies. And then you've got at the other end, you've got things like Journey, which is very sort of bare and sparse, but I've heard very touching stories from people about the sort of like personal effect that experience had on them. And there was one that really sort of got to me where somebody had recently lost their father, and they were playing through this game, and they came across another player, and together, them and that player managed to work out what they were doing. And together, I mean, this is obviously another player in real life somewhere in the world. This person was there, and together they worked out what they were supposed to be doing. And then towards the very end of the game, they had to split up, and there was a moment when they were looking at each other before they left. And for that player playing, it was like saying goodbye to their father in that moment before they went to the top of the mountain and completed the game. And it had a really profound impact on him. Now, if there wasn't space for that in the game, if the narrative was more overbearing and everything, then that wouldn't have given that player the release that they managed from that moment.
And there's some great examples, like you described. You God of War, fantastic narrative process. You feel engaged, and obviously when you find out who the boy is in the more recent version, that's a magical moment. I kind of knew it was coming, but the fact that I knew it was coming is part of why it was so joyful.
The payoff.
But the payoff is fantastic. But that's, again, it's a classic narrative, MacGuffin, for want of a better phrase. But the other way of looking at it is, so some games don't do it so successfully. I mean, my favorite games to hate, but I'm being a bit unfair because they are great games in themselves. Things like Final Fantasy XIV, when it first came out, you spend about 20 minutes pressing X with no actual impact other than, and similarly, The Last of Us, and a game one of my favorite games of all time, The Last of Us, and yet it is also one of the games I most despise in some of the narrative choices it made. Again, no offense intended to the team that made it. Amazing team, did an amazing game, but they force behaviors on the character that you thought you were making. So a decision is made, and actually it's odd. Interestingly, in the second one, they actually reference that other people were upset by this decision that's made. And I'm not going to spoil it in case anyone out there hasn't played it. Obviously, everyone in the world probably has. But there's this particular decision point really near the end where they take away the choice. And that is a betrayal of the player. So it's a really difficult thing to get right. And I mean, there's so many, like every narrative has got its own history of like the good examples, the bad examples. Games no different. But what's interesting for me is the impact of meaningful empowerment. The choices are what make games different. Even, and that could be another example. I'm at risk of talking too long. The Witcher 3 is a fantastic example of this, and we'll probably get into this if we talk about branching later. In The Witcher 3, you feel empowered. Whenever you have a dialogue, there are choices, but only the top one actually moves the plot forward.
But the rest is it builds
narrative, story, and excitement. You get to learn more, and I think that shows the range of the ways we can tell stories in games. And I think there's tons of lessons about what that means for anyone writing in any genre.
I think one of my favorite ones of these, sorry, I have to just mention this, is It Takes Two. And really near the beginning, this is one that doesn't have a choice, but it makes you squirm because the cutscene is all about you have to break a toy, and all the way through this cutscene, the toy is begging you not to break it, but as the player, to move the game along, you have to be complicit in it and pressing the button. And it is so cringy and also so funny at the same time, but also so awful that you're playing a part in it. And it's like you're complicit. And I know that there's no choice in that moment, but it is so well done because it does exactly what it says on the box. It is making you feel bad and complicit. And it's
so just for the sake of listeners who haven't played any games and don't really know,
given that about 86% of the population of the planet say they play games, it is the minority, but there are some. This is true.
But I suppose I think most of what we'll talk about will be the role-playing narrative type games, and I think to make a comparison, I think some people say that playing a role-playing game either on a computer, TV, or a tabletop role-playing game such as Dungeons and Dragons feels like a story evolving that they are a participant in. And I think that maybe is the crucial thing, the crucial difference between passively watching a movie or reading a book or a TV show and gaming. You're engaged in a story. There are cutscenes in video games where stories are kind of explained and elements of stories move along a bit, but then you have the autonomy as a participant and player in that. So
that's not quite true. Now, you happen to be talking to two people who love role-playing type experiences. So we've used examples that double down on that. But I'm going to, there's also kind of ways of looking at, so we don't just tell stories in the first person, second person, third person, like you would in a traditional writing style. Quite often we have roles like actor participant or actor observer. So quite often in a game, you're playing the minion. You are subordinate to the main characters who are taking the plot forward, and you are just doing their bidding and fulfilling the gaps between the narrative arcs with some gameplay action. But the progression can't happen until you've completed the action, whether that's doing a platform game exploration, or it's a sandbox, whether it's a kind of shooter, doesn't matter. So the point is that for a lot of games, there is just as much a linear narrative as any other story, but we are punctuating the gaps between the narrative moments, the nodes, if you like, with things of play, and they're typically some sort of like resolution that I have to do. Pick up the object, shoot the person, save the cat, whatever, pet the dog, whatever it might be. You've got these bits. What the subset that obviously we're obsessed with are when you start unlocking some of the reins, which is something only a game can do, and allow the players to contribute something. Now, what's interesting about the difference between a tabletop experience versus a computer game experience, and even a board game experience, is that we're typically going to have much more rails that we're stuck on, because you can't just have anything possible when you've got to have an outcome.
Yes.
So the degree to which we can be flexible and allow emergent properties of play to happen is dependent on the design and the kind of game experience. When we're talking about a role-playing game, we can literally destroy worlds. Isn't that amazing? We can create and destroy worlds in a heartbeat. But in a computer game, it's all down to what can we actually simulate and unlock for the player to be able to enjoy the story.
And presumably, Emily, we want to channel our players towards a certain denouement that is planned by the game writers or the dungeon master. Terminology to be explained.
I would absolutely bring up the fact that one of the first things that a lot of players do is try to find the edge of the game. And try to break the game, try to find where the game find the walls. And it's very annoying. Like the person who designed A Short Hike, for instance, it has a very clear path, but observed in the beta players that they would go the wrong way on purpose. So, and in that direction, there's nothing, there's nothing to do. So he had to put a tunnel into that pathway that these players would be tempted to explore, and it would take them right back to where they were meant to be. And so he had to account for those players and that behavior.
And you've got curiosity.
Exactly. And you've got games like Skyrim and like Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. Now those stories are, like Zelda especially, in those open world games, notoriously thin on the ground with the narrative. Like it has been criticized for that. The narrative is entirely optional. You can go through the whole thing and not know what the hell's going on. But yeah, there is an end point, and you can see it because the castle is there in the center the entire time, being the castle. But you can technically spend hours and hours and hours in this game avoiding the castle if you really want to.
I mean, I haven't spent 600 plus hours playing Skyrim. Oh wait. But one thing I would say is there's some interesting things that also come out of that. So you talked about the hike thing. One of the other interesting factors is that art, the way that we build the game, is part of that journey. So that could be about the theme and the experience. So something like Stray, which is beautiful. I mean, such a beautiful experience. The world comes to life because of it. But equally, let's take a Last of Us type moment, and I'm being chased by zombies, and I see a corridor, and I can go left or right, but I choose to go left because the lighting shows that way. When I eventually go back, I realize there wasn't a right at all. We were sent on a path which we thought we made a choice, but because of the art style, that choice
went down that.
Yeah.
See, I would say, I mean, like the obvious amazing version of like mocking the player and the choices they make is the Stanley Parable, where you have to, which is an absolute
The broom
masterclass in
cupboard
game
ending is the
writing.
best ending.
Oh my god, that is such a brilliant ending. Basically, for people who don't know the Stanley Parable, it's a narrator-driven game. The first choice that you're given is you come into this room with two doors, and the narrator says, "Stanley walked through the door on the left." So obviously players go through the one on the right. And that is absolutely what happens. And it's just mocking you. And the broom cupboard ending is you can go into a broom cupboard and stand there. And the narrator will narrate the fact that you are standing in this broom cupboard. And you can be in there for how long? I think it's like half an hour.
It's like 15, 20 minutes, something like that,
yeah.
I think. Yeah.
You can just be in a broom cupboard. And
it's the best ending.
Like, yeah.
Oh, by the way, it's not
fantastic.
actually an ending. It's a joke that there is no ending through cover. He just sits there and says, "You're still there."
Yeah.
Still there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I mean, that's not the language, but it's that sort of thing, isn't it?
It is that kind of language. Yeah. So, like playing with player choice, playing with that. I mean, with the Stanley Parable, you are given so much freedom, but it's the sarcasm that comes along with that. And it points out player behavior to the player the entire time, commentating on these decisions that the player makes subconsciously in all of the games, and narrates and makes fun of you for those decisions that you make every game you play. And it is so very good.
You can't not mention Portal when you talk about that kind of experience as well. Because
the cake is a lie. The cake is a lie.
Exactly.
Well, listeners, if you can hear a strange whooshing sound in the background, that's the sound of game references whistling past my ears. Because as mentioned, I'm not really a gamer, but
this is what happens when you talk to certified game nerds.
Yeah. I've picked the wrong guests here.
No, it's good because you keep us sane, Chris. I'll try us from going too deep.
I'll try and do that.
Steer us back on track. Yeah.
I mean, we're way beyond my depth already, but let's try and I'll put my my water wings on and let's see if we can get back on track. So, I want to talk a little bit about writing in the games industry, because it is an industry that perhaps a while ago didn't particularly value the quality of writing that I think we're now seeing. And if any of you listeners also listen to our Writers Gym podcast, which myself and Emily made, we had Rhianna Pratchett, the great Sir Terry Pratchett's daughter, who was a writer.
Rhianna's awesome in her own right. I mean,
absolutely,
the stuff she's done is amazing.
A writer in the games industry back in the day when there were no or hardly any female writers in the games industry, and we heard some of her experiences and her frustrations as a writer in that industry. But I wonder if you two could just sort of say a few words about writing in the games industry, what it entails, and what opportunities are out there for writers, please.
I mean, I can dive in, but
I'll shut you up now.
Well, I will dive in. So the first thing I'd say is that games writing has always been important to lots of people. The problem is games are the most complicated thing to make, because we've got to have coders, we've got to have artists, we've got to have money, we've got to have an audience, we've got to have marketing, we've got to have publishing. There are so many community. I mean, now the most difficult thing is that we're going to do all this stuff and someone's going to stream it and you've got to still want them to play.
Yeah.
So it's quite often the writer will be brought in quite late.
Yeah.
So the objectives, the structure, the design of the game has already been done. And in fact, most game designers don't actually design the overarching game. Most game designers are doing little system bits here and there. The game concept has already been sold as an idea to the publisher or the funder, and the kind of core top level already been defined. So as a writer, you're coming in. Again, Emily, I don't know what your experience a bit, but because I'm usually the product owner, I don't usually get involved in writing. I'm usually trying to say, okay, can we make sure that gets done, and where are we on that, and this kind of thing. So in some ways, the writing is a servant to gameplay, but sometimes that's just causes too many problems for making a good experience for the player. Anyway, sorry, Emily, what's your experience?
Yeah, no, it leads to shallow narrative, because technically what you do in the game needs to reflect the story. It needs to reflect the journey of the character. Otherwise, it's inauthentic. And if you are coming in late to the process, you are technically putting a band-aid on something that already exists, trying to tie it together with a story that makes sense, that's going to be compelling, that's going to be genuine for the player to play, while giving them the freedom to do what they want. But you're coming in so late to the game that there is no sort of, like the framework is already there. You just have to like put a thin layer of story on top, because that's all you can do in order to make a deep experience of a game. You need to be there writing it from the beginning, and the writing and the style of writing needs to be part of the original concept. Early example of this, one of the best early examples of this, would be the Monkey Island games by LucasArts, which were fantastic. Now, they were an absolute unicorn, because they were at the Skywalker Ranch, I think that's what it's called, and they were basically given any amount of money and told to make something great, and that was it. And so they had all of the time in the world, and they could make something brilliant, and something brilliant came out of it. Shock horror. Nowadays, you have to, justify the amount of money you spend. And getting a writer involved can be seen by people near the top as an unnecessary expense. Why are we paying this person to come up with content that may or may not end up in the end game? We should make the game first, and then the content that is put into it will definitely be in the game at the end. But that is a deep misunderstanding of the foundation that narrative plays. And in talking about this, what I'm talking about is the fact that game levels, quests, all of these things need to be intrinsic to the character's storyline. The character will not do A unless will not do B and C unless they have already done A. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. But what you end up with without narrative design is the character doing B, C, D, E, and F without doing A first. And therefore it makes no sense. Or, like putting A in the middle of this process. And it's like, oh, suddenly there's a reaction happening that should have come right at the beginning. But there's no sense to it now, because it's all over.
Yeah, well, this is kind of like why I think it's so interesting thinking about different styles of writing. So for me, I'm okay with things not necessarily appearing in order. In fact, that presents a different kind of storytelling process.
I mean, it depends on the game that you're making. It really does. Yeah.
Well, obviously, games like The Rapture, or all of those kind of. My brain is now frozen on those games' names, but there's a whole bunch of games out there where you are basically doing found object processes. It's sort of like a epistolary kind of style where you're discovering essentially fragments, and this style of writing appears all over the place. Not saying it's the best option, but you might get an audio playback of something narratively, which is a snippet. You might pick up a historical document, and you might end up having a conversation with somebody as an NPC, and you then pull together the information. Now, there are techniques that I don't think we've seen used yet effectively, like one of my favorite techniques a friend of mine uses for D&D style games is he has a history for each location that is going to happen. But if you're there when that happens, you can change it. And that creates a really interesting model for the world evolving to solve the problem Emily's describing, because these things will happen unless you're there, in which case you can change them. So that's a sort of different way of writing. Again, we don't see much of it. But then there's also amazing indie games out there. So I'm thinking about, for example, my friend Alex's game, The Quiet Things, that she's working on. So that's Silver Script Gaming. So she's writing an autobiographical game. So this is a game where you're literally going through the process based on her diaries, exploring her mental health issues and, traumas, which is an incredibly brave thing to do. And, but that shows that, the kinds of content that is out there where the story can lead, but it does tend to be either the people who want to make movies really, but they're making a game because they can, and that's where I include things like The Last of Us. I'm being a bit unfair, but like I say, it is one of the best games out there. Please do not think I don't like it, but it's not something everybody can do.
I mean, I would say, like, this is the thing about games, is that there are so many varied types of game. And, like in terms of narrative, you kind of, when you're going into making a game, you need to work out what type of game you are making first, what you want the end experience to be. Fantastic games come from being very linear, and you are playing a very preset story. But the storytelling is fantastic and the experience is fantastic and it builds. But, and then you've got the other end of the scale. Very good games as well, completely different style of storytelling. And this is one of the amazing things about game writing, that there is it's so varied.
It's so varied, yeah.
You can't necessarily, it's just an amazing medium to get into, because it stretches you in terms of what each thing can achieve.
And it's amazing how narrative can be used to solve functional problems. So, for example, I was working on a game, it wasn't very successful, but lots of reasons. It was blockchain, all that other thing. Yes, lots of bad things about that too. But anyway, but the point was, it was a location-based game, where we were doing shooting. So you're shooting the other players. Now, the trouble is, with an AR game, and you're shooting, and you're in a real-world park running around. And at the same time, there's just been a whole bunch of school shootings in America, and you're about to go on Apple. You've got to do something about it. So what do? We created a virtual world that you'd play in. You'd still be in physical space running around. So I had to write a whole section on the kind of the excuse for why that happened. And we came up with this whole idea that we're actually in a simulation, according to this game, and you're finding tears in the world. And you step through the tears and enter the base layer of the simulation to fight the other people who are trying to destroy the world, whatever it might be. And that, creating that deceit, allowed us to have a reason why you were running around a park with real world, and only when you went through the tear were you able to start playing the shooter game.
Okay, yeah.
So it made it very interesting for the player and engaging. But it meant we solved a technical problem without looking like idiots.
And a current affairs problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, Oscar, I'm really interested in, you've mentioned lots of games that you've been involved in at fairly senior and fundamental levels. I mean, can you tell us a little bit in more depth? Obviously, we gave you an intro at the start of the podcast, but what is it you do in the gaming industry?
What do I do? That's a question lots of people ask. Yeah, so I mean, I've been around in games for 26 years. I started off running game platforms. So, for example, I worked on I think a Wireplay. For those who are old and grey like me, they might remember that there used to be a dial-up modem-based service that BT had. I used to run that long time ago. My claim to fame on that was the Counter-Strike team. So Counter-Strike, one of the biggest games out there, they were doing their testing at that stage, and we were running a lot of their testing work, and they ran out of money. So I bought them some new computers, therefore saving the game. Therefore, it's all me. No, it's not. But, it's kind of nice to have been part of that history. Yeah, thank you. Honestly, the number of people who genuinely think I'm serious about saving the game, but they're also really, really nice about it, because let's face it, what an amazing experience. That's a thing that's still around 26 years later.
Yeah.
So I got to be part of that whole emerging online gaming scene. I also worked at 3, the mobile operator. We launched the Java-based mobile games long before there was an iPhone. There were games on phones. They were mostly not great because the devices were not great. But we basically made more money per user than any other operator in the world. So I was doing a lot of the kind of commercial design of that, which has kind of led to a lot of the other stuff I've done. So I've always been, at heart, my passion is designing games. I got into the industry because I wrote a tabletop role-playing game, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. And that made the team think, this must be a real game person. Who might make you think that? But I've ended up doing a lot of commercial elements because, I'm a trained marketeer. I kind of understand how to think about ethical monetization. So I do a lot of that consulting. Quite a lot of what I get doing is I end up doing is being asked to save a game when it's not making the numbers. But probably the most fun thing I got to do, I was working at PlayStation as essentially we called it home architect, but it was basically deciding what the platform should be. So this was PlayStation's virtual world back in like 2008 2015. So I got to be kind of essentially a pivotal role in making sure that we built the right systems. Beyond that, I've done a whole bunch of fun things, consulted on more games than probably anyone should ever look at. I've probably played hundreds of thousands of games, but we've never counted, and mostly for judging purposes. But also I was a Unity evangelist. The reason why I wear the hat is because I spent 5.5 years as Unity's evangelist for their ads product, which meant I was on stage talking to game developers around the world constantly. I think I did an average of 42 conferences a year.
Oof.
Lord. Oof.
Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah.
So the hat became a trademark.
Became a trademark, yeah. And I host all of the Pocket Gamer events, and I host a lot of other conferences. I wrote the book on games as a service, and I'm writing a book right now on game economy design. But basically, my passion is how do you make games that players love, and how do we do it in a way that means that the game team can make another one.
Exactly. And that's the thing about funding. It's very interesting you say that about having marketing expertise when it comes to games, because so many game studios do not or are odds almost with the marketing team, because they think that the marketing team is taking away the fun by saying we need to include these elements or this thing won't be profitable and we won't be able to make any more. And they're like, but the art. And it's like, no, we need to be able to actually market this thing. We need to have a target audience. We need to know who we're selling this to. And all of that is very, very important. Comes from my marketing background as well, but also working in game teams where every time we spoke to them, it was like we were popping a balloon. Because they'll have
popping their hopes and dreams.
Yeah, because they'd have designed this game, and then we came along and asked pesky questions like, okay, so who's the target audience for this game? Like, who is going to play this game eventually? And they'd be like, we don't know. And those questions that are so important.
My favorite line is, why should the player care?
Yes.
Oh, I love that. I use slightly more fruity language when I describe it. But frankly, I think that's but the thing to remember is the legacy of this comes from history. So the tradition of a developer being beholden to a publisher for the money to make the game, but they would then make the game they wanted to make. But then only when they've made the game does it get handed over to the marketing team in the publisher, who never were part of the process in the first place.
I mean, my favorite line is, if it's a good game, it will sell. As if the market isn't already massively saturated with games, and you don't actually have to do any work in order to get it onto the front page of Steam or into the charts on on anything to make it visible. If it's a good game, it will sell.
Well, we'd never say that. We'd never say that about a book, would we? You'd never.
No, exactly.
As someone who does game publishing, I feel that particularly we had a game which launched in November last year, a cozy game, lovely game. The 15 other cozy games launched the same week, and then the day zero patch had bugs. So we went from like 89% positive to 60% positive. Look, the point about it is,
but it will sell magically. It will sell. Don't you know that?
Well, no, it's your fault. Your marketing didn't work.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So no, that's not the conversation for this team. It's more complicated than that. But the point I'm trying to get to is that it's such a messy, complicated business being in games, and that's why I quite like the fact that we're trying to focus our attention on the narrative part of it, because that's a little cleaner in some ways, but as I think Emily has described very nicely, messy too.
Yes. Well, look,
Nothing simple.
Nothing simple.
I want to focus on a particular type of gaming and a means of disseminating uh, information about games and game stories, really. And that is the concept of the actual play kind of audio drama. And so, I mean, Emily, perhaps could you just give us an explanation? I mean, I know both of you are involved in this world. Emily, can you give us an explanation of what an actual play game would be?
Okay, so basically, it's like D&D. Well, it is D&D. But
Very often, I suppose it's D&D.
yeah, like normally it's D&D or D&D adjacent. It's that style. Everyone knows what D&D is, thanks to sort of the resurgence recently. So I'm going to say it's normally
because
D&D.
of Stranger Things.
Because of Stranger Things, yes, that's
yeah.
a very and people get together and perform and do one of these games, and that game is then recorded for audio purposes, split up into episodes or recorded one episode at a time, so like a D&D session would be. And I mean, Critical Role really took this on board and sort of made it a visual performance on YouTube, but you get the ones that are audio only. And the actors in it, or the performers, take on the role of their characters, and it is very entertaining. And the listener is basically on the road for this improvised story with the thrill of knowing that it can go in any direction, and knowing that the relationships that spring up and the events that spring up, you're never really sure if the DM meant for that to happen or not. And that is a wonderful thing for a listener to be asking the whole
time. And if the DM's good enough, they'll disguise the fact that, God, I wasn't expecting that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, everything is planned. You know, I don't improvise anything.
So Oscar, so you're a DM in one of these.
I've been doing this stuff. I've been DMing since I was 12 years old. I DM Traveller was my first game with my uncles and family, and they took outrageous advantage of my naivety in many ways, but it was also fun. I started playing D&D when I was 10. We're talking about 1979, so basically just shortly after it came out. And I think my uncle had the original white-coated books back in the
Gary Gygax
ones, So I mean, these kind of like the role-playing games are my bread and butter in terms of like who I am. What founded me. In fact, I failed my A levels because I was spending too much time running heavy metal parties and playing D&D,
which is a great reason for failing your A levels, really. Isn't it?
For my mind, that was my apprenticeship. Because let's face it, I ended up in games, so it can't be too bad.
But how many teachers told you you'd never get a job doing games?
Actually, I didn't even think that there was a job in games. We're talking about, if you think about, 1988 sort of. Well, actually, 1987, I made my first pitch to do a game. So me and my friends, we pitched a game concept. It went into Firebird, which was a BT owned game publisher back in the day, and they said, "Great idea, come back when you've made it." We had no money. My coder went off and worked for Oracle and basically built Oracle's payroll platform. So when you've got someone who's talented and you lose them, it's heartbreaking. But hey, it was my best man. I can't complain.
Having used Oracle's payroll platform in a previous life, it was quite a game in itself, actually.
It's quite a game just to work out what the hell was going on. So I spent years and years going to conventions with board games I'd designed, role-playing games I designed. And essentially what was fascinating, we're talking about Let's Play now, but we ran games where we had this like emotional journey of the point where a player character was having to say goodbye to their dragon girlfriend. Yes, I know these things happen. And
I always play as a dragonborn, so
makes sense.
Bear with us, listeners. This will
but
make
the point
sense.
was that we had an audience. This moment was so big that the whole of the games club were watching this conversation going on, and I don't know why I never connected the dots between that experience and what would then come when YouTube existed. So I feel like I was there when this stuff was being done to audiences in game conferences, but yeah, we're talking about like very small compared to nowadays. But there was a thing called Gen Con back in the day.
Oh, I think
Um,
that's still going, isn't it?
well, Gen Con
Gen
in the
Con?
US is still going,
Oh,
but the
okay.
UK one hasn't been going for a long time.
Yeah.
UK Game Fest is basically it's and it's current one. In fact, I'm going to Dragon Meet, which is a small
Yeah.
one, which is on the 30th of November. Maybe before or after this goes out. I don't know, probably after. But the point is that interesting how we've seen this evolution of how tabletop games can tell stories at the same time. So I was writing at some events like 50-person live action role-playing games. And so how do you write a story for 50 people where, to Emily's point, the information has to be available to everybody, but they're not going to get it in the turn order that you might want it to. And therein is the game design. So being able to write stories that will have a successful conclusion where everybody feels like they are the champion of their story, where all of the information is out there, but it's going to eventually be leaked out. And how do you manage the leaking of that information and keep it engaging and let people make meaningful decisions? That's a different art form, and it's one I adore doing. And when you can create those kind of stories, it tells you different ways of thinking about what narrative stories are. It could be more of a
more open world,
exercise.
isn't it? It's like live open. It's IRL open world. Yeah.
So
when
Emily,
you sat in a community centre in the middle of a holiday camp in Christchurch with like 300 people all dressed up in costumes for different games, it can be a very fun experience.
I think we should probably we should probably just explain live action role playing as a concept there, because I mean it's literally taking the game, the concept of the game, the characters from the desktop where we would all be sitting around in jeans and t-shirt to actually dressing in a costume, actually going out into the 3D world with actual swords, well, probably foam.
Well, polymer swords and
the style that I do mostly tends to be the ones without the swords, more of a murder mystery style. But I also adore with the rubber swords, so latex-based weaponry, and there's some amazing systems out there. LTCP, these amazing. There are. I think it's the Gathering that has like 3,000 or so people turning up every summer and doing amazing things. There's so many amazing groups out there. I've got lots of friends who do a lot of it. In fact, Chris, who's on our podcast, has rekindled his love of it recently and is going to every possible event he can.
Amazing. Yeah.
But the point there is that what you were saying is we're dressing up. So there's a cosplay element. We're acting and improvising. So there's a kind of acting element. There's a narrative storytelling we're part of the creation of, but also there are rules. And the reason for the rules is the rules effectively liberate you. I know it sounds weird that rules liberate you, but in the context of a LARP, the rules allow you to know the frame in which you can engage with people and how to resolve questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so interesting about it. It's a niche thing. Not everyone's going to be into it, absolutely, because of these levels, but it's a uniquely enjoyable experience.
Excellent. Now, so back to the actual play audio drama side of things. Emily, I know that I think this very week, actually, you have been participating in an actual play recording. So tell us a little bit about that, please.
Oh, okay. So I was playing the role of a half elf who was a disciple of the Raven Queen. And it was very enjoyable. It was for Fable and Folly, which is a big sort of platform for multiple audio dramas,
including the Dex Legacy, and that was why you were invited to be part of it, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. I
was invited to be part of it as well, but I politely declined because I was washing my hair that night.
I did not politely decline. I went straight for it. And, like my medium is very scripted. And I found myself amongst people who are very good at this improv thing, like world-class improvs. So I was a little bit sort of intimidated, but I think, I did my best. And
you did your best, elf.
I had the worst rolls, and this is something that happens when you're in Let's Plays because you can never
Rolls,
actually
rolls
predict.
as in
You
dice
have
rolls,
to
as
use
opposed to
dice rolls.
yeah.
Yeah, so you can, I mean, Critical Role has its name because you're there ready with the dice, and dependent on how your dice lands, depends on whether or not you're going to survive a situation
Yep.
or be triumphant. And when someone has repeatedly bad rolls, and I mean under 5,
Out
which
of
is
20.
critical fail out of 20, you have a d20, yes, which is your dice with 20
Yep.
sides. And consistently in all of the battles, I was rolling 5s or under, and it was tragic. I mean, a good roll for me in that game was a 12, which is barely a pass.
Slightly
In
above
fact,
average.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's like it's just dreadful. So, but you can never know if that's going to happen, and then the story has to sort of like work that out. It's like, okay, so what does happen here? And when you are triumphant in something, you then get to, or I got to, describe exactly what happened. So, the DM would say, okay, you've succeeded. Tell us what happens next. And I was saying, I swing my weapon, this thing explodes into 1,000 pieces, scattering light across the surface. And like, you get really, really into it, like with these visualized descriptions.
So again, this is one of the reasons I think, and the fundamental reason behind this podcast, things like that really play into the hands of a writer, don't they? Someone who can describe things, and you can play these things in a sort of half-hearted manner, but the more you put into them, the more you're going to get out of it. So, Oscar, tell us about because you have a podcast, an actual play
so
podcast as well.
I'm creating something. We call it Anything Could Happen Show. It's basically based on one of the games I wrote years and years and years ago, and actually ran at these conventions where I was talking about these kind of LARP type things. But I'm a big fan of. So whilst dice are great, and I love dice because it adds this tension, it's really interesting when you put players against each other. So a lot of the kind of traditional actual plays, you've got a referee who's doing most of the talking, and well, not always, but quite often. And then you've got the players telling the referee what they're doing, and he's interpreting that. They are interpreting that process. And that's great, and that's a great thing. It is a shared common storytelling process, but the point is that there is somebody doing the interpretation generally.
Yeah.
So what I try to do with Anything That Happens, I want to turn it on its head, where I, as the host, say as little as possible. I set the thing up. I provide a brief for everybody. They've got an objective. They've got a challenge. They've got maybe a secret that they want to keep, or they know. They've got some relationship maybe with some of the other players. Now, typically in a game, you're going to be playing your hero character again and again and again. But in these games, the dilemma is the hero. The world, the universe, which is a science fiction based context. So I'll place you in a situation. The classic example is the one we did in the pilot, which is, let's say Emily was the captain of the starship. Okay, we've just been in a massive battle. The Malankai have been attacking you. You've never met them before. Brand new alien encounter, and you've managed to defeat them. Thank goodness. 3 of their ships are destroyed.
Well done, Emily. Well done.
Through my absolute prowess and leadership and strategic thinking,
and starship steering and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, your starship is also destroyed.
Come on.
And you've got all of your crew, all your main crew are off in life pods. There are 4 people left on the bridge. You've got
figures
yourself.
As well.
Yeah, exactly. You've got yourself. You've got your Malankai prisoner. You've got a medical officer, and you've got the security officer. Medical officer and a prisoner. Sorry, you've got a prisoner. So anyway, the point being is that they've all got different roles. They've all got different reasons for being there. They've all got reasons why somebody else shouldn't get into the life pod. There are 4 life pods, but 2 of them are slightly damaged.
Oh.
By the way, they're never going to be fixed, but I don't tell you they're never going to be fixed until about 10 minutes in. In 20 minutes' time, the starship is going to blow up. That's not changing. And then I just let you go. And the conversation happens. The captain gets to decide who gets in the life pod or not. but everyone gets to argue why it should be
So
them and not the other person.
you going down with the ship, Emily, or are you off?
Well, I've already got that sorted because the medical officer will refuse to go down on a life pod unless the captain also does.
Okay.
Because as far as they're concerned, there's no senior officer left to look after the rest of the crew. So they're all going to die if the captain doesn't stay alive.
Mm.
So 2 life
So you're
pods left.
okay. You're okay, Emily.
Yeah.
I mean, I am very important. So, it's not surprising, really.
But the fun of this is that obviously the point is I'm saying as little as possible. Behind the scenes, I can nudge things. People will try anything because anything could happen. They could try anything they like. And I will let them do that. And I will give them updates. For example, Karim, who's a friend of mine who has been on a bunch of podcasts, I'm sure you guys know about.
Legend. Yep.
Legend.
Yes.
He decided completely out of the blue that the pronunciation of the species name was not Malanki as it always used to be. It's Malankai. And that they're an aquatic race, which they never used to be, but they are now.
Okay.
And the joy of it is that the players evolve the universe as much as they resolve the scene. And then at the end of that 20 minutes, we have a debrief where people cough up to the secrets they had, the problems they had. And it's so funny when one of the players turned around and said, I had a gun. I forgot I had a gun. I could have... Little things like that are just so fun. And so we're creating these stories, these little moments. Every different game is set with different characters. There's real stakes. Your character may not survive, and that's okay. We try and deal with real human problems, but because it's abstracted as a science fiction story, we can deal with political and emotional and theoretical issues that might be a little bit too close to home if we did it, as the real world. So we're trying to build that up. It's all very new. We're inviting lots of fun people to try and join in.
Yeah, I can't wait. I cannot wait.
Cannot wait to have you involved.
You're going to be part of this, Emily.
I am so excited. To be involved. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. For me, the debriefs are the most fun bit because you've got all these questions, and also the time factor is so important in these games, and you do have this stress level with them, especially when you've got a time limit. I don't know about you, but whenever, like in Portal, for instance, you've got puzzles to solve. But as soon as there was a puzzle with a countdown, I just lost my head. I just could not.
The stakes are risen.
I was like, I cannot. This is just too stressful. My palms are sweaty on the controller. I've got like palpitations. It's just the worst. So as soon as I get into that situation, I mean, I'm going to be okay in the game. I just want to say this, Oscar. That's not going to be.
We want you to be comfortable and safe. But the fun bit, as you say, it's what I love about it though is the level of creative thinking that happens under stress. And it's a well-known psychological phenomenon about both being safe, helping creativity, but also tension being important for creativity. And so hopefully we create that great balance where people feel comfortable and safe and also under real stakes.
Yeah.
Really,
sounds great. So Oscar, we'll put a link to your podcast.
Thank you very much.
In the show notes of this one. Emily, I don't know whether your Fable and Folly one will be out at the point that this goes out, but we will link to it if we can.
I doubt it, but our episode will be on the Dex Legacy feed.
Yes,
so
it will.
If you subscribe to the Dex Legacy, because what we're doing with this is it's going to be split up
across all the shows of the participants.
Yeah. So basically, the Dex Legacy, I think, is going to be episode 3, and on the Dex Legacy feed, there will be links to episodes 2 and 4, so you can get to
follow it along.
You can follow it along across feeds
and discover a few other audio drama shows along the way, hopefully.
Yeah, that's the idea. It provides a stepping stone across a whole bunch of people who you might not have discovered anyway. So if you're interested in that story, wherein I am playing a Raven Queen disciple,
and who wouldn't be?
I mean, it's very Poe.
I'm just disappointed you're not Dragonborn.
I couldn't be. That wasn't an option. Oh my god, Dragonborn Paladin. I am normally a paladin just for Divine Smite.
Just because you want to annoy the other players, I know.
Just for Divine Smite. It is just for that, because oh my god, it's satisfying. But anyway, that's an
Yeah.
aside. Yes, please, if you subscribe to the Dex feed, you will get that experience. It will come up.
We'll put a
So,
link to that in the show notes as well.
yes.
Uh,
Okay, so I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Oscar, was about DMing, and specifically, a lot of people do DMing and everything, but and also love games and have thought about game writing. Do you think that DMing is a good grounding for people who want to get into game writing in general?
So, I mean, one of the things I would say though is that there's so many different styles and techniques
Mm,
of game writing. They have different contributions. So,
mm,
what I think where I was lucky is because I wanted to design games and I wanted to do that anyway. So when I was coming up with world building for board games, I learned one set of techniques. When I was sitting in the loft with my mates working out our adventure and campaign over many, many years, that was a different style of writing. You learn things like the issue of escalating power.
mm,
So when you're
mm,
dealing with a DMing, you're often having to deal with the fact that players are getting more powerful, they're having to deal with more monsters, but you get to a stage where it becomes almost overheated. So how do you compensate for that? And if you're going to apply game writing from that exercise, from that lesson, you've got to be able to take a step back. And again, it comes back to, I think, is it Stephen King's On Writing, which is one of my favorite kind of like explorations of it. You've got to be reading 2 hours a day and writing 2 hours a day. I think the same thing applies to game making. Is you've got to be paying attention, not just to written pieces, but also game experiences, because the more you're exposed to what techniques work, the more you're going to be able to apply those techniques. I don't think somebody who writes a D&D game for their mates is necessarily going to write the best game. Sorry, yeah, or even the best story. I mean,
yeah.
typically, that's not going to be the case. But if you're experimental, you try different styles of game. I mean, I've run every style of game imaginable: horror, fantasy, sci-fi. I've run real world stuff. I tried writing a game based on Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is an amazing principle. But the point being is that it was the experimentation and the practicing of dialogue with real people, where you're improvising and acting. It's that combination of skill sets that makes, I think, a really good starting point for writing. But it's only a starting point.
I mean, I would say like the sort of benefit of it is that you are aware of the player and player behavior within a world and responding to that, providing the responses, providing the information through NPCs, basically, for those players, which is a key skill. But I mean, I agree that a DM doesn't necessarily make a good game writer, because you need to have constructed story. You need to have a constructed. And I know some DMs who have tried to go into this, but have never written a short story in their life, have never written a novel in their life, so don't actually know how to construct a narrative over a long period of time, have like no practice in doing that and dictating that level of dictator that you kind of have to know.
I mean, I think you raised an interesting point there. I think it's the feedback loop as well that you're getting. So the turns of phrase, the description quality, the having to repeat different things in different circumstances without them seeming the same, making sure that the person at the other end gets the difference. I think you're also making a good point where, you generally want to start with a kind of very sort of standard story format. You've got to start on a foundation that makes sense. Some of the more advanced techniques I'm talking about with like LARP writing or epistolary kind of style formats, or dealing with found object style narratives, they're much more advanced in terms of attitude and approach, and they're very doable. But if you haven't got a basic principles of like, a start, middle, and end, the initial incident, the rising tension, and the resolution, these kind of different narrative structures, whether it's a Joseph Campbell style or a 5-act play or the styles out there, these are all applicable to games. but they do require a translation in terms of the format and the experience because we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I've chatted to DMs before who have said, I'm going to write a book. And I said, oh, good. And I say, who are the characters? And they're like, I don't know. I've built this amazing world. And it's, they've built this incredible world that's very, very detailed, but they don't have a clue what's going to happen in it because previously they've always relied on the players to drive the actual narrative. And they themselves don't necessarily know how to create the characters who are going to do that themselves and dictate that. If you are a DM and you're listening to this and you are hoping to go into writing a book, it is a very different thing. And I would say, you know how to build a world, trust yourself in that, forget it, work on the characters. And the world will come because that's your bread and butter. Work on the characters first. And it's horrible to put aside the thing that you are very good at. But part of the creative process is to trust that you've got the skills to be able to do that. Now work on what you don't have the skills to do.
And the stories are so critically dependent on character arc. Exactly. If there isn't motion in the characters, why will I care? And I think whilst that's more complicated in a game because of this whole problem of are you actually playing the protagonist or are you playing the actor participant or actor observer, these different styles of writing are vital to understand, but you still at the end of the day have a character, whether that character is the spaceship like in Firefly, Serenity is a character. If it's the world, like many games out there, the world evolution is part of it, or if it's the hero figures in the story, it doesn't matter. They've got to have a journey, otherwise we're not going to care. There's no stakes that matter.
So one might say then that for a writer, as you've mentioned, Emily, and I think we talked about this on the Writers' Gym as well. We had a whole episode about world building, didn't we? Being a DM, dungeon master, games master, or whatever the title is in the game you're playing, would be indeed a fantastic way of learning about world building. But perhaps being a player would tell you a lot about character development and actually the way that human beings react in an improvised manner, which is kind of how life happens to us in the real world, isn't it? We don't get to sit and plan out our story arc for ourselves because otherwise everyone's lives would be great, wouldn't they? So we deal with what is given to us, and that is the way that games work, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
in many ways.
But it also highlights that what games are is that freedom from the real world. That ability to explore, and that's how mammals have learned for millions of years. This is not just mammals, but almost every creature that has a playful element to it is doing that as an exploration of the possible. And it's also, I think, why games is such a fundamental human behavior as well, and in particular why the computer games industry is the number one form of digital entertainment on the planet. Bigger than movies and music combined.
It's the classic brilliant sandpit for fuck about and find out.
Yep, exactly that.
Isn't it? Like in a safe environment.
Thanks for that, Emily. I'll bleep that out. That's fine. Mess around and discover.
In a good way, not in the nasty way that's been used recently. So
Yes. Yes. Well, look, I think with Emily swearing as she did there, that's probably a cue to reluctantly, I think, end this discussion because we could.
I should have started out with that, really.
We should, and then I could have just stopped this after 2 minutes, and no one would have been harmed in the making of this podcast. But listen, it's been a great discussion. Oscar, tell us a little bit about how our listeners can find out more about you, your podcast, your world, and what you do.
Great. So I'm easily found as at Athanasius, Athanateus, on almost every social platform out there. I am in the middle of transitioning to Blue Sky, but I am still on the others too. It is the ACH Dilemma Show on Twitter. I'm about to move that on to Blue Sky as well. We are on Spotify and YouTube currently. I'm about to expand all that out. But basically, if you want to find me, I am Googleable. So Google Oscar Clarke Games, you will find me, the guy in the hat. I'm unmissable.
Indeed. And as I mentioned earlier, links, clickable links in the show notes of this podcast.
Fantastic.
Emily Inkpen, how will people find you when you're not dressed as an elf?
Oh, like I am everywhere. Emily Inkpen, very, very simple to find. So if you just Google my name, website will come up. Dex Legacy, information about that is all there. If you go into any podcast platform and search the Dex Legacy, it'll come up. So yeah, that's
excellent. And Blue Sky, we should say you'll also find alternative stories on Blue Sky, and it is a very nice place to be right now. So do come and play. I'll also put the alternative stories links, as I always do, actually, in the show notes as well. So come and find us, say hello, join the happy band on Blue Sky and the less than happy band on other platforms that I won't mention. but for now, indeed. Oscar Clarke, Emily Inkpen, thank you so much for taking us through your worlds of gaming. And listeners, I hope you've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.